Chapter 19. A Bad Case of the Sillies. Allison started up the stairs 5 minutes before the bell rang for school to start. The stairs were completely empty. Allison liked it that way. When the bell rang, the stairs would be crammed with 1,000 screaming kids scurrying to their rooms, but now it was nice and peaceful. She walked up past the 18th story and toward the 20th. There was no 19th story in Wayside School. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. There was no Miss Zarves. Allison didn't understand it. If there was no 19th story, then wasn't her class really on the 29th? Suddenly, she heard footsteps charging up behind her. She turned around to see Ron and Dee Dee racing. She leaned against the wall to get out of their way, but Dee Dee stamped on her foot. Then Ron's elbow jammed her in the stomach. "Ugh!" she grunted as she fell and rolled down 3 steps. Dee Dee and Ron didn't even stop to say they were sorry. Allison slowly stood up. Fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but her windbreaker was torn. She thought Ron and Dee Dee were silly. They race up the stairs, and then when they get to Mrs. Jewell's room, they're too tired to learn anything. Allison thought all the kids in Mrs. Jewell's class were silly, even Rondi, and Rondi was her best friend. Then there was Jason, who was always pestering her. That was because Jason didn't like her, or else he loved her. Allison wasn't sure which. When she got to class, Dee Dee and Ron were sitting with their heads flat on their desks and their tongues hanging out. "You could have said you were sorry," Allison said as she walked past them. She sat up straight in her chair, folded her hands on her desk, and waited as everyone else wandered in. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside it. "Look what I brought," he said. "What's the name of your goldfish?" asked Mrs. Jewels. "Shark," said Jason. Everyone laughed. Allison rolled her eyes. "It makes him feel important," Jason explained. "Where should I put him?" "How about on top of the coat closet?" suggested Mrs. Jewels. Jason had to stand on a chair on his tiptoes. He held the bowl at the very bottom as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Suddenly, the chair toppled over. "Ah, gulp!" yelled Jason as he fell on the floor. He was holding the bowl upside down above his wet face. Mrs. Jewels hurried to the back of the room. "Quick, somebody fill the bowl with water," she said. "Where's Shark?" Jason made a face. "I swallowed him." The class went crazy. What a show-off, thought Allison. Mrs. Jewels rang her cowbell and told everyone to settle down. "You have a bad case of the Sillies this morning," she said. She took attendance. "Who's absent?" she asked. "Allison," said Rondi. "Very funny, Rondi," said Allison. "Anybody besides Allison?" asked Mrs. Jewels. "I'm here, Mrs. Jewels," said Allison. She sat behind Eric Fry, so she thought Mrs. Jewels couldn't see her. Eric Fry was the biggest kid in the class. "Just Allison," said Mrs. Jewels. She marked it on her attendance. "Damien, will you please take the attendance to the office?" Allison stood up. "I'm not absent," she said. Damien took attendance and walked out the door. "Mrs. Jewels, did you just mark me absent?" asked Allison. Mrs. Jewels didn't answer her. Allison marched to her desk. "Mrs. Jewels, did you mark me absent?" she asked again. Mrs. Jewels looked up. "Terence, what are you whispering about?" "Nothing," mumbled Terence. "If you can say it to Jenny, you can say it to me," said Mrs. Jewels. "Get off my case, buzzard face," said Terence. "Terence!" exclaimed Mrs. Jewels. "Go write your name on the chalkboard under the word discipline." "But that's what I said to Jenny," Terence protested. "Mrs. Jewels, what about me?" Allison demanded. Mrs. Jewels ignored her. Allison screamed as loud as she could. Mrs. Jewels didn't hear her. Allison faced the class. "Can't anybody see me?" she asked. Nobody answered her. "Rondi?" shouted Allison. "Dana? Jason?" "This isn't funny," said Allison. "I know you're all just pretending." She stood right in front of Jason, leaned over his desk, and stared him straight in the eye. "I know you can see me," she said. "You're trying not to laugh." He stared right through her. She stuck her tongue at him. He leaned forward, causing Allison's tongue to lick his nose. "Yuck!" she exclaimed, then wiped her tongue on her sleeve. Mrs. Jewls began the morning lesson. "Have you gone crazy?" shouted Allison. She ran out of the room and down to the class on the 29th story. "Come quick," she said. "There's something wrong with Mrs. Jewls' class." No one heard her. She slammed the door, then continued down the stairs to the class on the 28th floor. No one saw her there either. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Is the whole school playing a joke on me?" she wondered. "It's not funny." She continued down the stairs, screaming anything that came to her head, hoping that someone, somewhere, would notice her. "Fish for sale! Fresh fish! Fat fish! Get your fresh fat fish!" A tall, skinny lady with very short hair stepped out of one of the classrooms. "Shh," she whispered. "This is a school, not a fish market." "You can hear me?" asked Allison. She was so happy she wanted to hug her. "Yes, I can hear you," the woman said sternly. "My whole class can hear you. You're making it impossible for us to get any work done." "I'm sorry," said Allison, "but something's wrong in Mrs. Jewls' class." "You'd better come in here," said the teacher. Allison followed the teacher into her classroom. "What's your name?" the teacher asked her. "Allison." "Boys and girls, this is Allison," the teacher announced to her students. "She'll be joining our class." "What?" said Allison. "But my name is Miss Zarves," said the teacher. "Welcome to the 19th story."